There is an error so fundamental, so quietly installed at the base of every spiritual practice you have ever attempted, that correcting it alone would render every technique you already know instantly effective. Ernest Holmes identified it with clinical precision and called it the single greatest source of metaphysical failure in the modern student. You have been using the wrong tool for the most important work of your life. You have been attempting to create reality with thought, the servant, while the master sits unused waiting. Thought is a tool. Consciousness is the craftsman. And every spiritual student who has confused the two has spent years refining the hammer while the architect remains asleep. The distinction Holmes draws is not philosophical. It is mechanical. And the moment it lands in you, the entire architecture of your practice reorganizes. You have been doing the work, not occasionally, not half-heartedly. You have been consistent in a way that most people never manage. You understand the principles intellectually with a depth that most seekers never reach. You can articulate the law of mind with precision. You have maintained your affirmation practice. You have held your visualizations. You have studied Holmes, Murphy, Goddard, not as casual readers, but as serious students who took the instruction literally and applied it deliberately. And yet, after all of that, the gap between what you know and what you have continues to exist, stubbornly, silently, without explanation. That gap is not a measure of your failure. It is a diagnostic signal. And today, that signal gets interpreted. Holmes was not vague about this. He taught it directly in the science of mind, and he returned to it repeatedly across his lectures because he observed the same pattern in practitioners at every level of sophistication. The error was not in the technique. The error was in the operative center from which the technique was being applied. You have been operating the instrument without engaging the operator. Thought, no matter how refined, no matter how positively directed or precisely worded, is only the signal. Consciousness is the transmitter until the transmitter is correctly engaged, until you have shifted from identifying with the thought to identifying with the awareness in which thought arises. The signal goes nowhere with any reliable force. You have not been failing. You have been transmitting without a carrier wave. The promise of what follows is not a new technique. It is something far more consequential. You do not need to learn a new system. Every tool you already possess, every affirmation, every visualization, every treatment you have ever practiced already contains the full potential of the result you sought. What is missing is not more knowledge. It is the correct understanding of who is holding the tool. You need to discover who the practitioner actually is. And Holmes answers that question with the same clinical certainty he applied to every metaphysical law he ever articulated. You are not your thoughts. You are the consciousness in which your thoughts arise. And that single recognition, properly installed, changes everything that follows it. In this video, we will execute Holmes's most precise distinction, the exact mechanical difference between thinking and being, between the activity of thought and the nature of consciousness itself. And we will establish the operative protocol that places the craftsman back in command of the tool. We are not here to explore this idea philosophically. We are here to install it as a working mechanism. We will move step by step from the diagnosis of thought dependence through the foundational logic of consciousness as first cause, into the precise architectural protocol Holmes derived from that logic. And we will do so with the kind of clinical exactness that does not leave the practitioner guessing about what to do next. We will identify the specific errors that keep the practitioner locked at the thought level. Habits of practice so deeply embedded that most students are completely unaware they are operating them. We will examine the evidence that validates this distinction, not from belief, but from the same structural logic that governs electromagnetic transmission. And we will conclude with a practice directive that requires nothing new from you, only 60 seconds of correct positioning, applied 3 times in the next 24 hours. But there is one specific pattern Holmes identified that guarantees the practitioner remains permanently trapped at the level of thought, a habit so quietly installed, so easily mistaken for diligence, that it masquerades as the very dedication it is undermining. We will name it exactly, and we will name it in Part 4. If this law is now yours, if you have already recognized something in the first 2 minutes of this video that matches a pattern you have been trying to name for years, then make that recognition operative. Remain in this laboratory. What follows in this channel is not content. It is a curriculum of precision that builds on itself layer by layer, the way a structural engineer builds a foundation before raising a wall. To leave and return only by chance is to apply the law of accident to your own initiation. And there is one action available to you right now that is not symbolic. It is operative. Write the words, "I am consciousness," in the comments below, not as a reply to this video, not as an expression of enthusiasm, as a decree, as the first command you issue from the correct identity before the work begins. The law responds to declaration. The practice begins now. Ernest Holmes made a distinction that most of his contemporaries failed to fully appreciate, and that most of his successors have failed to adequately teach. He distinguished with absolute precision between thought and consciousness, and he located the entire operative power of spiritual practice not in thought, but in consciousness. This is not a semantic refinement. It is a structural reorientation of the entire enterprise of metaphysical work. Thought, Holmes taught, is a movement. It is an event that occurs within a field. It has direction, content, duration, and force. But it is not the field itself. Consciousness is the field, the ground of awareness in which every thought arises, moves through its arc, and dissolves. The error that most practitioners commit, and commit consistently across years of dedicated practice, is the identification of themselves with the movement rather than with the field. Consider what this means in practice. When you identify yourself as a thinker, as a being whose primary activity and primary nature is the production and processing of thoughts, you have repositioned yourself as a passenger in the vehicle rather than as the driver. You have located your operative center inside the very instrument you are attempting to use, and an instrument cannot operate itself. A hammer does not drive the nail. A hammer is driven. When the practitioner identifies with thought, they have handed the operative authority back to the tool and then wonder why the tool produces inconsistent results. Holmes saw this pattern in student after student, and he identified it not as a spiritual failing, but as a mechanical misunderstanding, a blueprint problem, not a character flaw. The law of mind, as Holmes articulated it in The Science of Mind, responds not to what you think, but to what you are. not to the specific content of your mental activity, but to the state of consciousness that is generating that mental activity. This is the precise point where most practitioners' understanding breaks down, because the popular presentation of metaphysical law has overwhelmingly emphasized the content of thought. Think positive thoughts, affirm the good, visualize the outcome, while leaving the nature of the consciousness doing the thinking almost entirely unexamined. The result is a generation of practitioners who have become extraordinarily skilled at managing the content of their thoughts, while the consciousness from which those thoughts arise remains unchanged, undeveloped, and fundamentally misidentified. Two practitioners can hold the identical affirmation, word for word, tone for tone, repetition for repetition, and produce radically different results. This is not mysterious. It is not a sign that the law is capricious or that one practitioner is spiritually favored over another. It is the direct, inevitable consequence of the law operating exactly as Holmes described. The thought is the same. The consciousness is not. The content of the signal is identical. The power and coherence of the transmitter is different. And the transmitter, the state of consciousness from which the thought is being projected, determines the result with the same mathematical certainty that a radio tower's power determines its broadcast range. The law is not producing different results because it is inconsistent. It is producing exactly the results that the consciousness of each practitioner commands. Holmes was unequivocal on this point, and his unequivocal clarity is worth sitting with. He taught that to change the results, you must change the consciousness, not the words of the affirmation, not the precision of the visualization, not the duration of the practice, the consciousness. And then, this is the mechanism. When the consciousness changes, the thoughts change automatically. When the state of the field shifts, the movements that arise within the field shift accordingly. The reverse, however, does not operate. You cannot change the consciousness by changing the thoughts, because the thoughts are produced by the consciousness. You cannot correct the output by manipulating the output. You must address the source of the output. This is not a philosophical position. It is a description of how the system actually works. Think of a river and its source. The river's character, its temperature, its mineral content, its direction of flow, its force, is entirely determined by the nature of its source. You can alter the downstream course of the river by building structures in its path. You can redirect it, channel it, temporarily dam it. But its fundamental character will always reassert the nature of its origin. Practitioners who work exclusively at the level of thought are building structures downstream. They are channeling, redirecting, and temporarily damming the current, and they are exhausted by the effort, because the source continues to generate the same character of water regardless of their downstream interventions. Holmes's instruction is radical in its simplicity. Go to the source, alter the source. The river changes on its own. The nature of consciousness, as Holmes defined it within the science of mind framework, is not personal in the ordinary sense. Consciousness, in its deepest sense, is the one universal mind expressing itself through the individual. The individual consciousness is not a separate, isolated unit of awareness operating in a vacuum. It is a point of self-awareness within the infinite field of universal mind, capable of drawing upon the full intelligence, substance, and creative power of that field to the precise degree that it recognizes its unity with it. This is the thinker Holmes referred to, not the human personality with its history and fears and preferences, but the I am that stands behind the personality, prior to the personality, and uses the personality as its instrument of expression. The practitioner who has located this as their operative identity has found the correct position from which all effective metaphysical work is conducted. It follows that the entire history of a practitioner's ineffective application can be traced to a single specific misidentification. They have been operating from personality rather than from thinker. They have been speaking the law's language from the position of the effect rather than from the position of the first cause. And this matters with an exactness that cannot be overstated, because the law of mind is not a general force that distributes good randomly or according to effort. It is a specific, precise mechanism that responds to the level of consciousness from which a command is issued. A command issued from the personality, from the level of thought, emotion, and personal history, carries the authority of an effect attempting to command another effect. A command issued from consciousness, from the awareness that stands behind and above the personal, carries the authority of first cause. The law responds to these two commands with entirely different magnitudes of response. Holmes used the language of mold and substance consistently throughout his teaching, and that language is mechanically exact. Consciousness is the mold. Thought is the attempt to describe the mold. The universal substance, the undifferentiated creative medium that Holmes identified as the subconscious aspect of universal mind, takes its shape from the mold of consciousness, not from the verbal description of the mold. This is why a practitioner can spend years verbally describing a desired outcome and see little response, while another practitioner holds a state of consciousness that corresponds to the desired outcome and watches the substance take that shape with a swiftness that appears almost miraculous to the uninitiated. The substance is not responding to the description. It is responding to the mold. It is responding to what the consciousness is actually configured as, not what the thoughts are verbally claiming. The practitioner who has not yet grasped this distinction will typically respond to this teaching with a reasonable question. If consciousness is the operative factor, how does one change consciousness? This is the correct question, and Holmes answered it directly. You change consciousness not by adding new thoughts to it, but by disidentifying from the thoughts that are currently defining it. Consciousness, in its natural state, is not limited. It is not fearful. It does not carry the history of past failures or the anxiety of future uncertainties. These are qualities of thought, of the movement within the field, not qualities of the field itself. When you release your identification with the movement and locate yourself in the field, you discover that the field is, in Holmes's language, already aligned with the good. The practitioner's work is not to add good to their consciousness. It is to stop generating the identification with thought that is obscuring the good that consciousness already is. This is a precise and significant reversal of how most practitioners understand their work. The popular model of metaphysical practice is additive. Add more positive thoughts, add more affirmations, add more visualizations, accumulate more good mental content. Holmes's model is subtractive in its first movement. Subtract the false identification, release the mislocated operative center, return to the correct position. And from that position, the additive work of spiritual treatment, of affirmation and visualization and decree operates with a force and precision that is simply not available to the practitioner working from the thought level. The tools are the same. The position of the one holding the tools is different, and the position makes all the difference. Consciousness, Holmes insisted, is not something you develop from scratch. It is something you recognize. This distinction matters enormously because it removes the sense that the practitioner must construct an entirely new inner architecture before the law can begin to function for them. The consciousness that is first cause, the I am, the thinker, the point of universal mind individualized, is already present, already complete, already operative. It has always been there. The practitioner has simply been standing in front of it, so to speak, filling the space with the noise and activity of unexamined thought, and thereby obscuring from themselves the very power that was always available to them. The correction is a recognition, not a construction. It is the act of turning around, of redirecting attention from the activity of thought back to the awareness in which thought arises, and discovering, with something that can only be called relief, that the thinker was there all along. Therefore, the entirety of what Holmes called the science of mind, every technique, every treatment, every prayer, every affirmation in the entire canon of New Thought is most precisely understood not as a collection of tools for creating good thoughts, but as a curriculum for developing the practitioner's ability to operate from consciousness. The specific treatments Holmes prescribed are not formulas that produce results through the mechanical repetition of correct words. They are structured exercises for training the practitioner to hold a state of consciousness, a quality of awareness, a specific configuration of the thinker that the law of mind then translates into corresponding patterns of experience. The words point to the state. The state is the operative cause. The words, held without the corresponding state, are what Holmes called treatment without realization, technically correct, functionally inert. The implications of this for a practitioner who has been working conscientiously for years are both sobering and liberating. Sobering because it means that the years of technique without full result were not wasted. They were simply incomplete. Every practice conducted at the thought level was a step toward the correct understanding, not a detour from it. The vocabulary is familiar. The commitment is proven. What was missing was the precise understanding of which level of the system was doing the generating, liberating, because the correction requires no new equipment. The practitioner who understands that consciousness is the operative center does not need to throw away their existing practice and begin again. They need only to relocate the position from which that practice is conducted. Same tools, correct operator, entirely different results. The foundation of Holmes's teaching, then, reduces to a single operational principle that contains within it the complete reorganization of the practitioner's inner life. You are not a thinker who has consciousness. You are consciousness that has thoughts. The inversion is total. The consequences are total. And everything that follows in this curriculum is the systematic unpacking of what that inversion means in practice, mechanically, precisely, and without the ambiguity of mere inspiration. The thinker has been present in you from the beginning. It is present now. The work ahead is simply the work of learning to operate from there, and then operating from there with the same consistency and deliberateness that you have already demonstrated for years at every level except the correct one. The most useful analogy for understanding the relationship between thought and consciousness, and for making that understanding immediately operative rather than merely intellectual, is the relationship between a projector's film and its light source. Consider the mechanics precisely. A film projector contains two essential and distinct elements. The first is the film itself, the sequence of images, the specific visual content, the frames of information that constitute the message to be communicated. The second is the light source, the lamp within the projector that illuminates the film and drives its images outward onto the screen with sufficient force and coherence to make them visible and legible. The film is the thought. The light source is consciousness. And the distinction between these two elements is not trivial. It is the difference between content and capacity, between message and medium, between what is being said and the power of the voice that is saying it. A high-quality film run through a weak projector produces a dim, distorted image. You can have the most precisely crafted sequence of frames, the most detailed, most carefully designed visual content imaginable, and if the light source is insufficient, the image on the screen will be washed out, unclear, and incapable of commanding attention. Conversely, a simple film, even a film with relatively modest content, run through a brilliant, high-powered projector, fills the screen with such clarity and force that every detail commands the viewer's full attention. The quality of the image on the screen is determined primarily by the power of the light, not by the sophistication of the film. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is a description of the exact mechanical relationship that Holmes identified between the consciousness doing the thinking and the thoughts themselves. Holmes taught, and this is the point that separates his understanding from the popular presentation of metaphysical law, that most practitioners spend the entirety of their practice improving the film. They craft better affirmations, construct more precise visualizations, select more powerful words, design more sophisticated mental images. They become extraordinarily skilled filmmakers, and every refinement they make to the film is a genuine refinement. The content of the thought does matter, and a more precisely crafted affirmation is, in isolation, superior to a vaguely worded one. But the refinement of the film cannot compensate for the insufficiency of the light source. The practitioner who has spent 5 years perfecting their affirmations while leaving their consciousness undeveloped and misdirected is a master filmmaker working with a broken projector. The films are exquisite. The screen remains dim. It follows from this analogy that the correction is not the creation of a new film. The correction is the recognition and development of the light source. And here, the analogy reaches its most important implication. The practitioner is not the film. The practitioner is not even the projector as a machine. The practitioner is the light itself, the consciousness that animates the entire mechanism. This is the identification Holmes insists upon. When you say, "I am," you are not referring to your thoughts, your history, your habits of mind, or your personality. You are referring to the light, to the awareness that is prior to all content, that illuminates all content, and that determines the force with which that content is projected onto the screen of physical reality. The moment that identification is made and held, the entire dynamic of the practice changes. The projector analogy also clarifies why the same affirmation produces different results in different practitioners. Two practitioners standing side by side, both running the identical film, the same words, the same images, the same stated intention, will project two entirely different images onto the screen of their experience if their light sources are operating at different intensities or with different degrees of focus and coherence. The law is not favoring one over the other. It is doing precisely what it always does, projecting the image with a force and definition exactly proportional to the quality of the light source driving it. This is mathematical certainty, not spiritual favoritism, and it explains, with complete logical consistency, every instance in which two students of equal dedication and equal technical knowledge produce dramatically unequal results. The question of how to strengthen and direct the light source, how to develop consciousness as the operative center, is the question Holmes spent his entire career answering, and his answer was consistent across every book, every lecture, every treatment he ever gave. The light source is not strengthened by adding more to it from outside. It is uncovered. The light of consciousness in its natural, correctly positioned state is not weak. It is not insufficient. It is, Holmes insisted, the same light that created the universe, the individualized expression of the one universal mind, which is infinite in its intelligence and unlimited in its creative power. What diminishes the effective output of that light is not a deficiency in the light itself. It is the obscuration created by identification with thought, the layers of mental noise, anxious self-monitoring, and personality-level reaction that the practitioner has accumulated and then mistaken for themselves. Therefore, the work of consciousness development is, in its initial and most essential movement, the work of removing the obscuration. This is the precise logic behind the observer position that Holmes consistently taught as the prerequisite for effective spiritual treatment. The observer position, the act of recognizing oneself as the awareness in which thought occurs, rather than as the thought itself, is not a passive or merely philosophical stance. It is the act of removing the film from between the light source and the lens, so that the light can operate with its full, unobstructed force. When the practitioner steps back from identification with thought and locates themselves in consciousness, they are not retreating from their practice. They are engaging the correct level of the mechanism for the first time. The logic extends further, and it is important to follow it to its conclusion. If consciousness is the light source, and if the light source is, by nature, the individualized expression of universal mind, then the practitioner who has correctly located themselves in consciousness is not operating from a personal, limited, historically conditioned center. They are operating from the point where the individual and the universal touch, where the finite opens into the infinite. Holmes called this the recognition of one's unity with the one universal mind, and he taught that this recognition, when genuinely held rather than merely intellectually affirmed, releases into the practitioner's experience the full creative power of that universal intelligence. This is not mysticism. This is the logical consequence of correctly identifying the operative center. If you are the light, and the light is the expression of universal mind, then the limits you have been experiencing are not limits of the light. They are limits of the identification, limits of the belief that you are the film rather than the projector, the signal rather than the source. The screen, in this analogy, is physical reality, the world of effects, circumstances, conditions, and experiences that you observe as your life. Holmes was unambiguous. The screen is always and only a projection. It has no independent existence apart from the consciousness that is generating it. This is not a mystical claim in the sense of being beyond verification. It is the inevitable logical conclusion of the position that consciousness is first cause. If first cause is consciousness, then the screen, the effect, is entirely determined by and responsive to the cause. To attempt to change the screen by manipulating the screen is the fundamental metaphysical error. It is precisely equivalent to attempting to change a movie by arguing with the projected image on the wall. The image has no power to respond to your arguments. It is a projection. It will change only when the source changes. And the source is you, not the you of accumulated thought patterns and personal history, but the you of consciousness, of the light, of the I am that was always behind the film, always powering the projection, and always capable of generating an entirely different image the moment it recognized what it was and exercised its authority accordingly. Consequently, when Holmes speaks of spiritual mind treatment, when he describes the method of declaring a truth from within the recognition of the thinker, he is describing the act of the light source directing the film with full awareness that it is the light source. The treatment is not a petition. It is not a request directed to some external power. It is the thinker, consciousness operating as first cause, issuing a declaration about the nature of reality from a position of recognized authority. The declaration does not hope to produce an effect. It commands an effect with the same certainty that a transmitter commands its broadcast field. And the effect follows because the law of mind is not a conditional law. It is not selective or arbitrary. It is as precise and dependable as any law in physics. Given a correctly positioned, correctly identified consciousness, issuing a correctly formulated declaration, the law produces the corresponding effect with the certainty of a mathematical proof. Holmes staked his entire body of work on that certainty, and the architecture of what follows is the step-by-step protocol for entering that certainty yourself. The final implication of this foundation, and it must be stated clearly before we proceed, is that everything you have already practiced is not being discarded. The affirmations you have spoken, the visualizations you have constructed, the treatments you have administered, all of it retains its validity. Holmes was not teaching that technique is irrelevant. He was teaching that technique operated from the wrong level produces diminished results, and that the same technique operated from the correct level, from the consciousness of the thinker rather than the reactivity of thought, produces results that are, by comparison, of an entirely different order. You are not being asked to start over. You are being asked to reposition the operator. The instrument is already in your hand. The craftsman is already present. The work ahead is simply the work of returning the tool to the hand that was always meant to hold it, and then proceeding with the same dedication and precision you have already proven you possess. Before any operative work can succeed at the level of consciousness rather than thought, something must be established that most practitioners have never been explicitly taught to establish. Holmes called it the observer position, and he was clear that it is not a refinement of the practice. It is the prerequisite. Every affirmation spoken without it, every visualization constructed without it, every treatment administered without it is conducted from the position of the instrument rather than the operator. And an instrument operating itself is the definition of a system without a first cause. The observer position is the act of locating yourself consciously and deliberately on the correct side of the distinction Holmes drew, not as the thinker, but as the awareness in which thinking occurs. This is the step that the popular curriculum almost universally omits, and its omission is the single greatest predictor of why a disciplined practitioner does not produce results commensurate with their knowledge and effort. The observer position is accessed through a recognition so simple that its power is easy to underestimate. It is this: I am not this thought. I am the one who is aware of this thought. Hold that recognition for a moment before we unpack it, because its simplicity is not a sign of shallowness. It is a sign of precision. Holmes was always most precise when he was most simple. The recognition identifies two things that are operating simultaneously in every moment of your conscious experience: the content of the awareness, the thought, the image, the feeling, the memory, the anxiety, and the awareness itself, which is observing that content and is entirely distinct from it. Most practitioners have spent their entire practice lives inside the content, attempting to improve it, police it, and redirect it without ever stepping back to occupy the awareness that was observing all of it. The observer position is that step back, and it is the most important single movement in the entire science of consciousness-directed living. Consider the river again, because the mechanics are worth making exact. When you are inside the current, when you are identified with the movement of thought, you are subject to the current's direction, force, and turbulence. You cannot choose the direction of the river from inside the river. You can struggle against it, you can move with it, you can attempt to navigate within it, but you cannot alter its fundamental course from within its flow. The bank is a different position entirely. From the bank, the river is something you observe, something you understand, and something you can begin to direct with structures and channels that a person inside the current cannot construct. Consciousness, your actual position as the thinker, is the bank. Thought is the current. The observer position is the act of stepping out of the current and standing on the bank. From the bank, you can direct the current. Inside the current, you are the current. This is not metaphor, this is mechanism. The first practice implication is immediate, and it is this: the observer position cannot be found through more thinking. This is the paradox that trips many practitioners at the outset, and it must be addressed directly. The mind that is immersed in thought cannot think its way to the observer position, because thinking is the very activity from which the observer position is a departure. You do not arrive at the observer position by constructing a thought that says, "I am the observer." You arrive at it by noticing, by directing attention not to the content of current mental activity, but to the fact of current mental activity. There is a thought occurring. There is a fear arising. There is a pattern of mental commentary running. The noticing of these events is not itself a thought in the same sense. It is awareness, recognizing the presence of thought. And that recognition, however brief, is the observer position. It is your natural position. It is the position of the thinker, and it can be held. Holmes drew a distinction that is worth articulating precisely here, because it clarifies what the observer position is not. The observer position is not detachment in the sense of emotional withdrawal or spiritual bypassing. It is not the act of becoming cold to your experience, remote from your circumstances, or indifferent to outcomes. That is a caricature of the teaching, and it has led many practitioners into a hollow, affect-suppressing practice that Holmes himself would have recognized immediately as another form of thought-level control dressed in metaphysical language. The observer position is full presence, more fully present to your experience than identification with thought ever allows, because identification with thought involves reactivity, which is a kind of perceptual tunnel that narrows your awareness to the loudest signal in the moment. The observer position expands awareness. You are more present, more clear, more capable of precise perception and deliberate action, not less. You are not stepping away from your life. You are stepping into the part of yourself that is actually capable of directing it. The physical analogy that Holmes employed when teaching this was the distinction between the room and the furniture. A room full of furniture is not defined by the furniture, although most people perceive the room as the collection of objects it contains. Remove every object from the room, and the room is not diminished. It is revealed. The room is the space in which the furniture exists. It is prior to the furniture. It is the precondition for the furniture's presence. Consciousness is the room. Thoughts are the furniture. When you identify yourself as a thought, even a very important thought, even the thought of your own history, aspirations, and accumulated understanding, you have mistaken the furniture for the room. The observer position is the recognition that you are the room. And because you are the room, the space, the field, the ground of awareness, you have the structural authority to arrange, rearrange, and ultimately redesign the furniture that occupies your space. The furniture does not arrange the room. The room contains the furniture. This is not a philosophical comfort. This is the operative principle from which all effective treatment proceeds. Now, there is a specific and important question about how the observer position relates to the quality of consciousness that Holmes described as the necessary condition for effective treatment. The settled certainty, the quiet knowing, the absence of anxiety about outcomes. This relationship is direct. The observer position is not merely a preliminary step before that quality of consciousness is achieved. The observer position is itself the entry point into that quality of consciousness, because the settled certainty Holmes describes is a quality of the field of awareness, not of the thought activity within it. The field, consciousness itself, is inherently still. It is inherently certain. It does not carry the anxious momentum of unresolved thought patterns. When the practitioner locates themselves in the field rather than in the activity, they make immediate contact with the stillness that is the natural character of the thinker. The certainty Holmes prescribes is not something that must be manufactured through effort. It is something that is encountered the moment the practitioner steps out of the current and onto the bank. It is there. It has always been there. The noise of thought identification was covering it. The observer position also has a specific and precise relationship to what Holmes called the mold, the configuration of consciousness that the subconscious aspect of universal mind accepts as its blueprint for producing corresponding conditions in the physical world. When the practitioner is identified with thought, the mold presented to the subconscious is not the mold of the desired outcome. It is the mold of the consciousness that is generating the unexamined thoughts, which typically includes the history of limitation, the patterns of conditional belief, the anxiety of unrealized desire. The subconscious does not read the content of the affirmation in isolation. It reads the total configuration of consciousness from which the affirmation is being projected. When the practitioner establishes the observer position before beginning any operative work, the configuration changes. The mold presented to the subconscious is no longer the mold of a reactive, thought-identified personality making a request. It is the mold of the thinker, the point of universal mind, issuing a decree from its natural position of authority. The subconscious, as Holmes taught consistently, accepts this decree and proceeds to organize the substance of reality accordingly. This is the mechanism. This is why the observer position is not a luxury. It is the operative prerequisite for every technique that follows. The practical question of how long it takes to establish the observer position is important to address, because practitioners who have spent years identified with thought naturally wonder whether they are capable of the shift and whether the shift requires years of sustained practice before it becomes operative. Holmes's answer, drawn directly from his clinical experience with thousands of students, was clear. The shift does not require years. It requires a moment of correct attention. The observer position is not a skill that is gradually built from nothing. It is a recognition that is made, and the first time it is genuinely made, however briefly, the practitioner has already crossed the threshold. What takes time is not the initial recognition, but the stabilization of the recognition, the gradual lengthening of the periods during which the practitioner can remain in the observer position before the habitual identification with thought reasserts itself. But even a brief, correctly made recognition is operative. Even a 60-second correctly positioned declaration from the observer position carries more generative force than an hour of effortful thought-level affirmation. This is Holmes's claim, and it is a claim with mechanical logic behind it. The quality of the transmitter, even for 60 seconds of clarity, exceeds the output of a continuously active but misaligned transmitter operating for hours. 60 seconds from the correct position is the beginning of mastery. It must also be established because the practitioner who has been doing serious work for years will encounter this question, that the observer position does not negate the importance of specific language, precise treatment formulation, or deliberate mental imagery. Holmes taught that clarity of thought matters. A precisely formulated treatment reflects a precisely configured consciousness, and that precision is valuable. What the observer position changes is not the importance of precision, but the level from which that precision is being applied. Precise language generated from within thought identification carries the authority of the thought level. Precise language issued from the observer position, from consciousness recognizing itself as the thinker, carries the authority of first cause. The precision is the same. The source of the precision is different, and the source determines the result. Holmes taught both the importance of correct form and the absolute primacy of correct position. The practitioner who has mastered correct form and has now learned correct position is, for the first time, in possession of both elements of the complete mechanism. The observer position, once genuinely accessed and held for even a short duration, produces a phenomenological shift that is immediately recognizable and entirely consistent with what Holmes described. The mental activity does not stop. The thoughts continue to arise, but they are perceived differently as events that are occurring within your awareness rather than events that constitute your awareness. A fear arising is noticed as a movement within the field, something that is passing through, not something that is defining. An anxious thought about finances or health or relationship is observed with a clarity and a distance that is not coldness, but perspective. The practitioner who has spent years being swept by these movements suddenly finds themselves standing on the bank, watching the current with a detachment that is not indifference, but authority. That shift in perception is the first direct evidence of consciousness operating as first cause, rather than thought operating as the operative center. It is subtle in its initial presentation. It is total in its implications. Holmes insisted, and this is the final point to establish about the observer position before we move into the activation protocol, that the observer position is not a temporary state to be visited during formal practice sessions and then abandoned during the activity of daily life. The goal of the practitioner is the gradual extension of the observer position into all of ordinary experience, not in a way that makes daily life feel like a continuous formal meditation, but in the sense that the fundamental identification with consciousness rather than thought becomes the default operative position from which all activity proceeds. The practitioner who achieves this, who walks through their daily experience as the awareness in which thoughts arise rather than as a being who is periodically ambushed by their thoughts, is operating the law at the level Holmes intended. They are not occasionally stepping back to observe the current from the bank. The bank is where they live. And from the bank, every tool in their possession, every technique, every treatment, every declaration is operated with the full authority of the thinker, which is the full authority of the one universal mind, individualized and active, bringing its mathematical certainty to bear on every area of their experience. The establishment of the observer position is therefore not the final step in the process. It is the first step, the step that makes every subsequent step possible. What follows from the observer position is not a return to the ordinary practice, as if the observer position were merely a warm-up. What follows is the execution of the complete activation protocol that transforms the observer position from a momentary recognition into a sustained operative state from which effective consciousness-level treatment can be conducted with the reliability and precision that Holmes's entire system was designed to produce. The observer position is the door. The next section is the room you enter when the door is correctly opened. The consciousness activation protocol is not a ritual. It is not a sequence of exercises to be performed in a dedicated space at a dedicated time and then set aside when the day's practical activity resumes. It is an operative procedure, a specific, ordered sequence of recognitions and declarations that systematically positions the practitioner in the correct relationship to the law of mind, and then issues commands from that position with the precision and authority that the law requires and deserves. Holmes designed his treatment protocol around exactly this sequence, though he rarely presented it in the step-by-step form that the modern practitioner requires for immediate application. What follows is that protocol, distilled to its essential mechanics, stated with the exactness that eliminates guesswork and makes the operative center immediately accessible. The first step is disidentification. Before beginning any affirmation, any visualization, any spiritual mind treatment, before issuing any declaration intended to engage the law of mind in any area of your experience, pause. This pause is not atmospheric, it is mechanical. In the pause, execute the single recognition that establishes the observer position. I am not my thoughts. I am the consciousness in which my thoughts appear. This recognition is not merely verbal, it is an act of directed attention, the attention moving from the content of current mental activity back to the awareness in which that content is arising. The content does not need to stop. The thoughts do not need to cease. What needs to happen is the relocation of the operative center from inside the current to the bank. The recognition is the relocation, and the test of whether the relocation has occurred is physical. It presents as a settling, a slight but unmistakable dropping of the habitual forward-leaning urgency of the thought-identified mind. There is a quality of presence without agenda, a quiet that is not empty but full. This is the craftsman picking up the tool rather than the tool animating itself. This settling is the signal that the first step is complete. Hold the settling before proceeding. This is important because the practitioner who is accustomed to thought-level practice will feel the pull to move immediately from the recognition into the affirmation. To use the recognition as a quick preparatory step, and then hurry back into the familiar territory of mental content. Resist this pull. The observer position is not merely a preliminary posture, it is the operative state from which the entire treatment gains its authority. To rush through it is to miss the mechanism. Holmes consistently taught that the quality of settling, the depth of the realization, as he termed it, was directly proportional to the quality of the treatment's effect. More specifically, a brief but genuine settling carries more operative force than a prolonged formal treatment conducted without it. Allow the settling to become palpable. Allow it to become, in Holmes's language, a felt recognition rather than a stated intention. When you can feel even slightly the difference between being inside the thought and being the awareness in which the thought is occurring, the first step is complete and the second can begin. The second step is the state declaration. This is the step where the practitioner, now operating from the observer position, declares not the outcome they desire, but the state of consciousness they are choosing, the quality of being from which the desired outcome naturally flows. This distinction is precise and it is critical. Most practitioners, when they move into affirmation, state the desired condition: I am healthy, I am prosperous, I am in perfect relationship. These statements are not wrong. Holmes himself used this form, but they are most effective when they are understood and issued as declarations of a state of consciousness, rather than as requests for an external condition. The difference in practice is this: instead of declaring the outcome as something you are claiming, declare the state of awareness from which that outcome is the inevitable expression. I am operating from the consciousness of abundance. I am the awareness in which perfect health is the established fact. I am the thinker whose natural expression is harmony in every relationship. The reason this form of declaration is more mechanically precise than the simple outcome statement is that it addresses the correct level of the system. Holmes taught that the subconscious aspect of universal mind, the creative medium that translates consciousness into physical conditions, responds to states of being with a precision it never applies to statements of wanting. The subconscious does not process desire. It processes identity. What you are, it expresses. What you want, it registers only as evidence that you do not yet have it. And it takes that registration as the blueprint. When the practitioner declares a state of consciousness, I am the awareness in which abundance is established, they are not expressing desire for abundance. They are declaring its establishment at the level of first cause. The subconscious receives this declaration from a consciousness that has established the observer position, recognizes it as the decree of the thinker, and proceeds to organize the substance of experience around it. This is the mechanism. This is why the state declaration is the second step and not the first. It is only mechanically effective when issued from the correctly positioned consciousness. Hold the state declaration for a duration. Holmes was specific about this. The treatment is not a statement that is made and immediately released. It is a state that is established and maintained long enough for the subconscious to receive it as a pattern, as a mold, rather than as a passing thought. The question of how long is addressed by Holmes' concept of realization. The treatment is complete when the state of consciousness it declares is no longer being asserted from outside, but has become, even momentarily, the actual configuration of the practitioner's awareness. The prosperity treatment is complete when the practitioner is no longer affirming abundance from within a consciousness of lack, when the consciousness itself, however briefly, has become the consciousness of abundance. That moment of genuine realization, not emotional enthusiasm but settled, quiet recognition, is the operative moment. It is the moment the mold is set. It is the moment the law is engaged, and it may take 30 seconds or 15 minutes, depending on the practitioner's current degree of facility with the observer position. But the moment itself, when it arrives, is unmistakable. Holmes described it as a click, the sensation of something that was held in tension releasing into certainty. The third step is the maintenance of identity. This is the step that the observer position must be extended into the ongoing activity of daily life, the step that most students of Holmes omit because it appears to require continuous, effortful attention of a kind that seems incompatible with normal functioning. But Holmes's description of this maintenance was not the description of continuous formal practice. It was the description of a specific practiced response to a specific, predictable event. The reassertion of thought identification throughout the day at unpredictable intervals. The habitual identification with thought will reassert itself. The anxiety will arise and claim to be you. The reactive commentary on circumstances will begin and feel like your genuine assessment of reality. The compulsive analysis of why things are not yet different will spin up and present itself as responsible mental work. These reassertions are not failures. They are the normal behavior of a psychological pattern that has been the default operating position for years or decades. The maintenance of identity is not the prevention of these reassertions. It is the practiced, deliberate response to them. I am the observer. This thought is moving through me. I am not moving through it. This response, practiced with consistency, performs a specific and measurable function. Every time the practitioner executes this return, every time they step from inside the current back to the bank, they are deepening the groove of the correct identification. They are, in Holmes's language, making the mold of consciousness identity incrementally more stable. The subconscious does not only receive the mold during formal treatment sessions, it receives it continuously as the background configuration of the consciousness that is generating the practitioner's ongoing experience. Every return to the observer position during the activity of the day is a real-time, continuous treatment, a continuous declaration to the subconscious that the operative identity is the thinker, not the thought. And the subconscious, receiving this declaration with increasing consistency, increasingly organizes the substance of experience around it. This is not a process that requires dramatic events or obvious milestones to be working. It is a continuous, structural reorganization of the practitioner's relationship to their own mind, and its effects, when they begin to appear in the world of circumstances, are not random. They are the precise mathematical consequence of a consciousness that has consistently presented a different mold to the creative medium in which all conditions are formed. It is important to address a common and predictable error in the application of the maintenance of identity step, because Holmes himself flagged it repeatedly. The error is the attempt to execute the return to the observer position through suppression of the thought rather than through disidentification from it. When a practitioner notices an anxious thought and attempts to eliminate it, to push it out of awareness, to refuse to think it, to aggressively replace it with a positive substitute, they are still operating at the thought level. They are still inside the current, just swimming harder in the opposite direction. The return that Holmes prescribes is not suppression. It is the shift of the operative center from the content of the thought to the awareness in which the thought is occurring. The thought may remain, the fear may continue to present its case, the anxious commentary may continue to run, but you are no longer inside it. You have moved to the bank, and from the bank you observe the current with the settled certainty that the thinker is not the current. The thought loses its operative authority not because it has been defeated, but because it has been correctly categorized. It is a movement in the field, not a definition of the field. That recategorization is the maintenance of identity, and it requires no suppression, no struggle, and no effort in the ordinary sense. It requires only the consistent exercise of directed attention. The consciousness activation protocol, taken as a complete sequence, disidentification, state declaration, maintenance of identity, is not a long or complex procedure. In its initial application, the first two steps together require no more than 2 to 5 minutes of deliberate attention. The third step is not a separate time allocation at all. It is the ongoing practice of a specific response to a predictable event. The entire protocol requires nothing new in the practitioner's schedule. It requires only the insertion of a 2 to 5 minute observer establishment before existing practice sessions, and the development of a single sentence response to the reassertion of thought identification during the day. These are minimal requirements in terms of time. They are total requirements in terms of result because they represent the complete repositioning of the operative center from which all existing practice is conducted. And as Holmes taught, it is not the quantity of practice that determines the quality of result. It is the level of the system at which the practice is being conducted. The practitioner who has applied this protocol consistently for even 30 days will notice a shift that is qualitatively different from anything produced by years of thought-level practice. The shift is not primarily in external circumstances, though external circumstances will begin to reorganize, and they will reorganize with a speed and coherence that is noticeably different from the incremental, effortful gains of thought-level work. The first shift is internal. It is the shift in the practitioner's relationship to their own mind, the thoughts that were once experienced as the primary reality of their inner life, the anxious thoughts, the limiting beliefs, the self-critical commentary, begin to be experienced as what Holmes always said they were: movements in a field, events in a space, content in an awareness that is not defined by that content. This shift in experience is the first, most fundamental, and most important result of the protocol. It is the practitioner beginning to live from the correct position. And from the correct position, the law that Holmes spent his entire life describing begins to operate with the precision, the reliability, and the mathematical certainty that was always its nature. And that was always available to the practitioner who found the right place to stand. Every tool the practitioner already possesses, the affirmations they have memorized, the treatment formats they have learned, the visualization practices they have developed, is now in the hands of the correct operator. Nothing needs to be discarded. Nothing needs to be replaced. The curriculum of technique the practitioner has accumulated over years of study is not rendered obsolete by the consciousness activation protocol. It is rendered effective. For the first time in the practice's history, the instrument is in the hands of the craftsman rather than operating itself. And in the hands of the craftsman, even the simplest tool produces results that the most sophisticated instrument operating without a master could never reliably achieve. This is the promise of the protocol. This is the mechanics of the correction. And this is the position from which the refinement of the practice, the identification and elimination of the specific errors that have kept the practitioner at the thought level, can now be addressed with the precision they deserve. There is a specific habit of practice that Holmes identified as the single most common and most damaging manifestation of thought-level dependency in the serious student. It is not laziness. It is not inconsistency. It is not a lack of knowledge. It is something that presents itself as the opposite of all three, as diligence, dedication, and rigor. This is what makes it so resistant to diagnosis. The practitioner who has been told that thought creates reality and who takes that instruction seriously will naturally respond by working harder at the level of thought. They will think more carefully, affirm more precisely, monitor their inner dialogue with greater vigilance, and audit their mental content with increasing thoroughness. They will, in short, attempt to improve their results by intensifying their engagement with the very instrument that Holmes identified as the secondary cause. Holmes called this pattern thought-level dependency, and he identified it as a compounding error, not simply a failure to advance, but an active deepening of the misidentification that is the root problem. The mechanics of this compounding must be understood clearly, because the practitioner who has been in this pattern for years will feel, upon first encountering this teaching, a natural resistance. Their dedication to mental discipline has felt like progress, and in one narrow sense it is. A more carefully monitored mind is better than a carelessly monitored one, all else being equal. But Holmes's point is that all else is not equal when the monitoring is happening from within the thought rather than from the observer position. The effort to control thought from within thought is the mind attempting to lift itself by its own bootstraps. It is logically impossible. A system cannot step outside itself to correct itself, using only its own internal resources. The practitioner who spends their practice sessions monitoring and adjusting their thoughts is attempting to do exactly this, to use the thought apparatus to fix the thought apparatus. And the result is not liberation from thought identification. It is a deeper, more exhausting, more intricate entanglement with it. The monitoring thought is still a thought. The effort to think correctly is still a thought. The entire enterprise, conducted from within the thought level, is a closed loop with no exit. And Holmes identified the practitioner caught in this loop immediately, because the signature of the loop is exhaustion combined with the conviction that one is almost there. The second fatal mistake is more subtle, and it operates in the emotional domain rather than the cognitive one. Many practitioners have understood correctly that the emotional component of their practice matters. They have understood that a declaration made with flat affect is less effective than one made with genuine feeling, and they have accordingly worked to amplify the emotional intensity of their affirmations. They generate excitement, enthusiasm, or a kind of forceful emotional investment in their stated intentions, and they take this emotional intensity as evidence that consciousness is being engaged. Holmes was precise and clinical about this confusion. Raw emotional heat is not elevated consciousness. It is a louder signal from the same instrument. Emotional intensity is still a quality of thought-level activity. It is thought with amplified energy attached to it, but it is still originating from the same level of the system that generates ordinary thinking. The projector analogy applies exactly. Turning up the volume on the film does not improve the quality of the light source. It is louder content. It is not a stronger transmitter. This is a consequential error because it is self-reinforcing. The practitioner who has learned to associate emotional intensity with operative power will judge their practice sessions by the degree of emotion generated, and will feel that a session conducted in the quiet, settled certainty of the observer position is somehow less powerful than one in which they work themselves into a state of passionate conviction. This judgment is precisely backwards. Holmes drew the distinction with characteristic precision. True consciousness engagement is characterized not by emotional intensity, but by settled certainty. The quality of knowing that is quiet, unmoved, and absolute. This is the certainty of the mathematician who has already done the calculation, not the excitement of someone hoping the answer comes out right. There is a profound difference between shouting a decree in the hope that volume will compensate for position and standing in the quiet awareness that the decree is already law. One is performance conducted from the thought level. The other is being conducted from consciousness. And the subconscious, that precise state-reading medium of universal mind, does not respond to the volume of the performance. It responds to the configuration of the being. Quiet certainty outperforms passionate performance every time, because quiet certainty is a quality of the consciousness, while passionate performance is a quality of the thought. The third error Holmes identified, and this one is particularly prevalent in the practitioner who has studied the law for many years, is what might be called premature technique sophistication. This is the pattern of the practitioner who, experiencing insufficient results from their basic practice, responds by adding complexity. More elaborate visualization sequences, more nuanced affirmation structures, more sophisticated layers of treatment. The implicit assumption is that the ineffectiveness of the practice is due to its insufficiency of detail, and that adding more detail, more precision, more technique will correct the deficiency. Holmes was direct about this. No degree of technique sophistication can compensate for the absence of the observer position. 100 layers of intricate technique, all applied from within thought identification, will not produce the result that one direct, simply stated treatment issued from the correctly positioned consciousness produces reliably. The practitioner who has added complexity in response to ineffective results has not addressed the root cause of the ineffectiveness. They have added more furniture to the room without recognizing that the room itself needs to be located. The sophistication of the technique is not the issue. The position of the operator is the issue, and until that position is corrected, adding sophistication is the equivalent of adding more instruments to an orchestra that has no conductor. The diagnostic question that Holmes recommended every practitioner apply to their own practice is this: when I complete a treatment session, am I more settled or more activated? The correctly positioned practice, conducted from the observer position with a state declaration that achieves genuine realization, should leave the practitioner more settled at the end of the session than they were at the beginning. The session should produce an increase in the quality of quiet certainty, a deepening of the sense that the law is engaged and operating, and a natural release of anxious attention to outcomes. If the practitioner ends their sessions feeling more energized in a forward-leaning, effortful way, more focused on the outcome, more aware of the gap between current conditions and desired conditions, more determined to think correctly, they have been practicing from within the thought level. They have been deepening the identification, not releasing it. The test is not the quality of the thoughts generated during the session. The test is the quality of the state at the end of it. Settled certainty is the signature of consciousness operating as first cause. Activated effortfulness is the signature of thought, attempting to do what only consciousness can do. Holmes also identified a specific manifestation of thought-level dependency that is unique to the advanced student. The one who has studied the law deeply enough to know that consciousness is the operative factor, and who then attempts to achieve the correct consciousness through intellectual understanding alone. This practitioner can articulate the distinction between thought and consciousness with complete accuracy. They can explain the observer position in precise theoretical terms. They can quote Holmes on the nature of the thinker and the function of universal mind, and yet they have not made the shift because intellectual understanding of the distinction is itself a thought-level activity. You can understand with perfect clarity the theory of the bank without ever having stood on the bank. The understanding is valuable. It is far better than not understanding, but it is not the practice. The observer position is not achieved by understanding it well. It is achieved by directing attention to the awareness rather than the content of awareness, and doing so repeatedly until the recognition becomes the default. Holmes was patient with the intellectual student, but he was also clear the law is not operated by those who can best describe it. It is operated by those who have correctly positioned themselves in relation to it. Knowledge is the map. The observer position is the territory. The work is to enter the territory, not to refine the map. The patterns described in this section, the thinking about thinking trap, the emotional confusion, the premature technique sophistication, the intellectual substitution, share a single root cause. They are all forms of the same fundamental error, the attempt to solve a consciousness-level problem with thought-level solutions. Each of these patterns is, in Holmes's framing, an intelligent person's misapplication of a correct general principle. The principle is correct. Improvement in mental activity produces improvement in results. The error is the assumption that the mental activity in question is thought rather than consciousness, performance rather than being, the content of awareness rather than the quality of awareness itself. The correction of these patterns does not require the abandonment of diligence, emotional engagement, technical sophistication, or intellectual understanding. It requires the relocation of all of these qualities from the thought level to the consciousness level, from inside the current to the bank, where they operate with the precision and authority of first cause rather than the effortful unpredictability of effect. The practitioner who has recognized themselves in one or more of these patterns should receive that recognition not as a judgment, but as the precise diagnostic signal Holmes intended it to be. The pattern is not a character flaw. It is a blueprint error, a structural misalignment in the practice that can be corrected with the same methodical precision that an engineer applies when identifying and correcting a design fault. The recognition of the pattern is already the beginning of the correction, because the practitioner who can observe their own thought-level dependency from the observer position has, in that moment of observation, already made the shift they need to make. They are standing on the bank, watching the current of habitual practice error flow past, and they are no longer inside it. That observation, that moment of clear, unentangled recognition, is itself the first, most important, and most reliable evidence that the correct operative center is accessible and active. Everything that follows is the practice of returning to it until it is no longer a destination to return to, but the place you already are. Holmes's final and most precise word on the question of error in metaphysical practice is this: the greatest obstacle the practitioner faces is not doubt, not lack of knowledge, and not insufficient technique. It is the subtle, pervasive, and almost entirely unconscious habit of taking the thought to be the thinker. Every error in practice can be traced back to this single confusion, and every correction in practice begins with this single recognition. You are not the thought. You are the thinker. And the thinker, the consciousness that stands behind every thought, that is, prior to every thought, that is the first cause from which every thought and every circumstance ultimately arises, is not damaged, not limited, and not in need of improvement. It needs only to be recognized. It needs only to be correctly occupied. And the practitioner who has done that, who has, even once, genuinely stood in the awareness and looked at the thought from the outside, has taken the first and most significant step toward the mastery that Holmes spent his entire life pointing toward. Holmes did not leave the question of consciousness primacy as an abstract principle. He stated it with the directness of a practitioner who had tested it clinically and found it to hold without exception. Here is his essential instruction, stated with the precision it deserves and the weight it carries. It is not the thought alone that creates. It is the consciousness behind the thought that gives it power. This is the core of the entire science of mind, not as philosophy, not as inspiration, but as mechanism. The thought is the form. The consciousness is the force that fills the form. Without the force, the form is empty. A vessel without contents, a declaration without authority, a signal without a carrier. Holmes drew this distinction repeatedly across his lectures and writings because he observed again and again that students who had learned to think correctly were still not producing results commensurate with the correctness of their thinking. The thought was right. The consciousness behind it was not yet elevated to the level that makes the thought operative. And the gap between the correct thought and the elevated consciousness was the gap that separated the student from the result. Two people may hold the identical thought, yet one will produce results and the other will not. Holmes stated this plainly without qualification because the evidence for it was available to any honest observer of metaphysical practice. The practitioner who cannot produce results does not need to be told that the law is real and that it works. They need to be told what they are not yet doing that makes it work. And what they are not yet doing is not thinking the right thoughts. They often are. What they are not yet doing is thinking those thoughts from the correct level of consciousness. They are operating the signal from a misaligned transmitter. They are running the film through a weak light source. They are issuing commands from the position of the effect rather than from the position of the cause. And the law, in its mathematical precision, responds to them from the position from which they are speaking. The difference is never in the thought. It is always in the state of consciousness that is doing the thinking. Elevate the consciousness, and every thought becomes a command. This is Holmes at his most direct and most consequential. Not every thought becomes a hope. Not every thought becomes a possibility. Every thought becomes a command, an operative instruction to the creative medium of universal mind that is executed with the reliability of natural law. The practitioner who has elevated their consciousness to the level of the thinker, who has established the observer position, declared the state of being rather than the state of wanting, and maintained the identity of first cause throughout their experience, finds that their thoughts are no longer the uncertain, effortful mental constructions of a practitioner hoping the law will respond. They are the natural, automatic, and effortless expressions of a consciousness that is operating at its correct level. They carry weight because they come from a place that has weight. They produce results because they are issued from a position that the law of mind recognizes as authoritative. The subconscious accepts them as molds because they are presented by the consciousness it is designed to serve. The thinker, the individualized expression of universal mind, operating with the full authority of its source, neglect the consciousness, and even the most perfectly crafted thought becomes noise. This is the shadow side of the same principle, and it must be stated with equal directness. A thought issued from an undeveloped, unlocated, misdirected consciousness. No matter how perfectly its words are crafted, no matter how precisely its imagery is constructed, no matter how diligently it is repeated, is a signal without a carrier wave. It enters the creative medium of the subconscious as one more piece of information among thousands, carrying no special authority, commanding no particular response, and producing no reliable result. It is not that the law fails in these cases. The law never fails. It is that the command is not being issued from the level of the system that the law is designed to obey. The subconscious takes its direction from consciousness, not from thought. When thought is presented without the backing of elevated consciousness, when the affirmation is spoken from within thought identification rather than from the observer position, the subconscious registers the total configuration of the consciousness presenting the affirmation, which includes the anxiety, the doubt, the history of limitation, and the underlying belief that the outcome is uncertain. It takes that total configuration as its mold, and it produces accordingly. The operational implication is total, and it is this: your first work is not the thought. Your first work is the consciousness. Before any affirmation, before any visualization, before any treatment, locate the thinker. Establish the observer position. Declare the state of being. Then speak the thought from that state. In that sequence, every technique you already possess becomes a command. Outside that sequence, no technique, however sophisticated, has reliable access to the level of the system that produces results. Holmes was not ambiguous about this priority. He placed consciousness first, always and without exception. The thought follows the consciousness. The technique serves the position. And the position, consciousness, correctly identified, correctly occupied, correctly declared, is the single factor that determines whether the law operates in your life with mathematical certainty or with the unpredictable, intermittent, partial results that most practitioners accept as the best that is available to them. It is not the best. It is the result of the mismatch. And the mismatch ends the moment the operator returns to the correct position and issues the first command from there. The distinction between thought and consciousness that Holmes identified as the central operative principle of the science of mind finds a precise structural parallel in one of the foundational mechanisms of electromagnetic transmission. A parallel so exact that it constitutes not a metaphor, but a functional analogy that illuminates the same underlying principle operating at different levels of the same universal system. In radio transmission, two entirely distinct elements must be present for communication to occur. The first is the signal, the specific content to be communicated, the encoded information, the message in all its detail and precision. The second is the carrier wave, the electromagnetic field of a specific frequency and amplitude onto which the signal is encoded and through which it travels from the transmitter to the receiver. The carrier wave is not the message. It does not contain the message in the way a box contains its contents. It is the medium through which the message travels, and the quality, coherence, and power of the carrier wave determines whether the message arrives at its destination intact, with force, and with the clarity necessary to be correctly received and acted upon. The parallel is exact. Thought is the signal. Consciousness is the carrier wave. The specific words of the affirmation, the precise imagery of the visualization, the carefully formulated language of the spiritual mind treatment. These are the content, the encoded information, the message the practitioner is attempting to transmit to the creative medium of universal mind. Consciousness, the field of awareness, the quality of the thinker, the degree to which the practitioner has correctly identified themselves with first cause, is the carrier wave. And as in electromagnetic transmission, the quality of the carrier wave determines the transmission. A weak or incoherent carrier wave will transmit a distorted or lost signal regardless of the clarity and precision of the original content. The content may be perfectly crafted. The message may be exactly right. But if the carrier wave is insufficient, the message either does not arrive or arrives so attenuated and distorted that the receiving system, the subconscious, the creative medium of universal mind, cannot register it as an operative command. Holmes's entire body of work, viewed through this lens, can be understood precisely as the science of developing the carrier wave, not improving the signal, though signal improvement, the craft of precise language and clear mental imagery, is part of the teaching, but strengthening, clarifying, and correctly directing the consciousness through which all signals are transmitted. The practical implication is immediate and structural. Two practitioners transmitting the same signal through carrier waves of different quality will produce results of entirely different quality. The difference is not in the message, it is in the medium. And the medium, consciousness, is entirely within the practitioner's operative capacity to develop, direct, and employ at its full potential once the correct understanding of its nature and its primacy is in place. The physics of carrier wave transmission extends the parallel usefully in one additional direction. A carrier wave that is coherent, that maintains a stable, consistent frequency without disruption or interference, transmits its signal with maximum fidelity, regardless of the distance it must travel. Coherence is the quality that determines not just whether the signal arrives, but whether it arrives whole. A practitioner whose consciousness maintains coherent identity with the observer position, who does not fluctuate rapidly between the thinker and the thought-identified personality, transmits with coherence. The declarations of that consciousness arrive at the creative medium of universal mind with their full operative authority intact. Conversely, A practitioner whose consciousness fluctuates, who holds the observer position during a formal treatment and then immediately collapses back into reactive thought identification as soon as the session ends, is transmitting an incoherent carrier wave. The signal may be excellent. The carrier disrupts its own transmission, and the result is the pattern that most experienced practitioners recognize with painful familiarity. Intermittent, partial, unpredictable results from a practice that they are applying with genuine consistency and genuine dedication. The concept of interference is equally relevant. In electromagnetic transmission, interference is the introduction of competing signals of the same or adjacent frequencies that disrupt the coherent transmission of the intended signal. Interference does not require the original signal to be weak. It requires only that competing signals of sufficient strength occupy the same transmission medium simultaneously. In terms of consciousness, the competing signals are the unexamined, habitual thought patterns that most practitioners carry as the background operating system of their personal consciousness. The beliefs about limitation, the expectations drawn from past experience, the ambient anxiety about outcomes that runs continuously beneath the formal practice. These are not failing the practitioner because they are thinking bad thoughts. They are failing the practitioner because the consciousness that is doing the formal practice is the same consciousness that, at every other moment, is broadcasting the competing signal of limitation, uncertainty, and conditional believing. The two signals occupy the same carrier, and the subconscious receives both. Holmes' instruction: establish the observer position, maintain the identity of the thinker throughout the day, not just during formal practice, is precisely the instruction to reduce interference. It is the protocol for coherence. It is the method of ensuring that the consciousness doing the treatment is not simultaneously broadcasting the contradictory content that cancels the treatment's effect. This is why identical affirmations produce different results in different practitioners, and why they produce different results in the same practitioner at different stages of their development. The signal is the same. The carrier is not. The practitioner, in the early stages of their practice, before the observer position is established as a stable default, has high levels of interference. The consciousness doing the formal treatment is the same consciousness that, moments later, registers the unchanged circumstances and generates the anxiety and doubt that broadcast the competing signal. As the practitioner develops stability in the observer position, as the coherence of the consciousness increases and the interference of habitual thought identification decreases, the carrier wave strengthens. The same affirmation transmitted through an increasingly coherent consciousness produces increasingly clear, rapid, and reliable results. Not because the affirmation has improved, because the carrier has improved, because the transmitter is now broadcasting with fewer competing signals and with greater stability of identity. The practitioner is the same person using the same tools, operating the same law. The consciousness, the carrier wave, is different, and the carrier wave is everything. The analogy extends to one further and important point. In electromagnetic transmission, the relationship between the transmitter and the receiver is not a matter of will or effort on the part of the transmitter, The transmitter does not have to force the receiver to receive. The transmitter does not have to convince the receiver to respond. The transmission occurs automatically as a function of the physics of the system when the transmitter is operating correctly at the correct frequency. The receiver responds because that is what receivers do when the transmission is coherent and correctly directed. This is the precise structural parallel to Holmes's teaching about the subconscious as the creative medium of universal mind. The practitioner who has established the correct consciousness does not have to force the subconscious to respond. They do not have to maintain anxious attention to the process of creation. They do not have to check repeatedly whether the law is working. The subconscious responds because that is what it does when the consciousness presenting the command is correctly positioned and coherently maintained. The law operates automatically, the way a receiver automatically responds to a coherent transmission. The practitioner's work is not to manage the law's response. The practitioner's work is to maintain the coherence of the transmission, and the rest, the translation of the consciousness into corresponding conditions, circumstances, and experiences, is the law's work, conducted with the mathematical certainty that is its fundamental character. The carrier wave analogy also clarifies why the results of consciousness level practice have a different character and quality than the results of thought level practice. Results produced by thought level work, by affirmation and visualization conducted from within thought identification, tend to be partial, effortful, and often temporary. They are obtained through sustained effort against the interference of the competing signal, and they tend to require continuous effort to maintain because the underlying consciousness that generated the competing signal has not changed. The results produced by consciousness level practice, by correctly positioned treatment conducted through a coherent carrier wave, tend to arrive differently. They have a quality of inevitability about them. They do not feel like achievements extracted from a resistant universe. They feel like the natural unfolding of a pattern that was already established at the level of consciousness, simply working its way through the medium of material conditions into visible form. Holmes described this quality consistently. The practitioner who operates at the consciousness level does not work for their results. They recognize their results. They see the conditions of their experience organizing themselves around the pattern of their consciousness with the same certainty that water organizes itself around the shape of its container. The shape is the consciousness. The water is the substance of universal mind, and the container determines the form with the same mathematical precision that governs every other law in the physical universe. The final implication of the carrier wave analogy, and it is the most liberating implication in this entire analysis, is this: the development of the carrier wave is not a matter of acquiring something you do not have. It is a matter of removing the interference that is attenuating the signal of a carrier wave that is already, in its nature, infinite in power and coherence. The consciousness that is first cause, the thinker, the individualized expression of universal mind, is not weak. It is not limited in its natural transmission power. What limits its effective broadcast is the interference of thought identification, the competing signal of the unexamined, fear-conditioned, historically burdened personality that most practitioners inhabit as their operative center. Remove the interference and the carrier wave. Your consciousness in its correct identity as the thinker, broadcasts with the full power of its source, which is universal mind, which is unlimited. This is what Holmes meant when he said that the science of mind is not the addition of spiritual power to a limited human being. It is the recognition of the unlimited power that the human being already is. When correctly identified and correctly positioned, the power is there. It has always been there. The interference is what you have been working to remove. And the observer position is the precise, mechanical, instantly accessible instrument for removing it. Holmes did not only teach in abstractions. He observed, he tested, and he recorded the results of his observations with the clinical attention of a practitioner who understood that a principle is only proven in its application. There is an account that illuminates the distinction between thought-level practice and consciousness-level practice with a clarity that no amount of theoretical exposition can fully replicate, because it describes the distinction as it appears in two actual human practitioners, side by side, applying the same law from different operative positions and producing results that are different in kind, not merely in degree. Two students came to Holmes within the same year, both presenting what was, on the surface, the same situation. Both had been affirming prosperity consistently for approximately 2 years. Both had studied the same foundational texts, the science of mind, the core New Thought literature. Both could articulate the law of mind with equal sophistication, explaining it to others with facility and apparent depth. Both were sincere, both were dedicated, and yet the contrast in their results was not a contrast of degree. It was a contrast of kind. The first had produced no measurable reorganization of his financial circumstances in 2 years of daily practice. The second had experienced, within the same period, a series of changes in her circumstances that she described as a radical reorganization, an opening of channels that had been closed, an alignment of factors that had previously been in conflict, a sense that the substance of her life was rearranging itself around a pattern she had established internally rather than constructed externally. Both had applied the same law. The results were not the same. Holmes examined both practitioners with the attention of a diagnostician who had seen this exact contrast many times and already knew what the examination would reveal. The first practitioner was what Holmes would recognize immediately as an active, effortful thinker. His practice sessions were intense, concentrated, deliberate. He worked at his affirmations with a quality of focused mental energy that was, in its way, impressive. But the energy was directed inward. He was monitoring his thoughts, assessing their quality, gauging whether he was affirming with sufficient conviction, comparing the current session with previous sessions, and maintaining a kind of internal audit of his practice's correctness. He was inside the current side. His energy was the energy of a practitioner trying very hard, trying to think correctly, trying to feel the right things, trying to generate the state Holmes described through the force of intellectual and emotional will. He was improving the film. He was doing it with extraordinary diligence, and the light source was untouched. The second practitioner described her practice differently, and the difference was in a single phrase. She described having found at some point in her second year of practice what she called a quiet place behind the thinking. She could not fully explain how she had found it, only that she had stopped during one particular session, trying to generate the right thoughts, and had simply noticed the silence that was already present when the effort to think correctly temporarily ceased. She had, in Holmes' language, inadvertently established the observer position, and from that position she had issued her declarations, not with intense emotional conviction, but with a quality of settled, simple certainty that was entirely different in its phenomenology from the effortful, monitored declarations of her earlier practice. The declarations felt, she said, less like statements she was making and more like recognitions she was naming, less like assertions and more like acknowledgments, and the results had followed, not instantly, not dramatically in a single event, but with a consistency and an inevitability that she described as the experience of circumstances organizing themselves around an already established internal fact. Holmes told the first practitioner, the dedicated, effortful, resultless applier of the law, with the directness and compassion that his clinical authority allowed, "You are trying to build a house by throwing bricks at it from a distance. Your colleague is placing each brick from inside the structure. The image is precise. The practitioner who is conducting their practice from within thought identification is at a distance from the creative mechanism. They are generating content and hoping it crosses the gap and reaches the level at which the law operates. The practitioner who has established the observer position is already inside the structure. They are at the level at which the law operates, issuing commands from the correct position, and the mechanism responds to those commands from the proximity of first cause rather than the distance of effect. Holmes instructed the first student specifically and systematically in the observer position. He described it in the terms we have established in this curriculum: the recognition that you are not the thought, but the awareness in which the thought arises. He gave him a single practice. Before every affirmation session, sit in silence. Not the silence of suppressing thought, but the silence of looking for the one who is having the thoughts. Find the noticing, locate the awareness, and from that location, speak the declaration, not perform it, not project it with emotional force. Speak it with the quiet authority of the one who is already behind the thinking. The student applied this instruction. Within 90 days, Holmes noted this timing specifically because 90 days was a period he had observed repeatedly. In students making the shift from thought level to consciousness level practice, the pattern broke. The circumstances began to reorganize. The channels that had been closed for 2 years began to open. The substance of his life began to take the shape of the consciousness he was now, for the first time, actually presenting to the creative medium of universal mind. This account is not presented here as a motivational story. It is presented as evidence of the precise mechanical principle that has been the subject of this entire curriculum. The difference between 2 years of failure and 90 days of result was not a difference in technique, in sincerity, in knowledge, or in dedication. It was a difference in the operative center from which the technique was being applied. Thought level versus consciousness level. Inside the current versus standing on the bank. Throwing bricks versus placing them from inside the structure. The law did not change. The student's knowledge of the law did not change. The student's position in relation to the law changed, and the law, being the precise and mathematically certain mechanism that Holmes always taught it to be, responded to the changed position with the immediate and appropriate adjustment of circumstances. This is the evidence. This is the mechanism. This is the proof that Holmes built his entire life's work upon. Not faith in an untested idea, but the clinical observation of a law operating exactly as described every time for every practitioner who correctly located themselves at the level from which it is operative. The practitioner, hearing this account, who recognizes the first student's pattern in their own history of practice, should receive that recognition as the most useful thing that has happened to their practice in years. Because the recognition is not a judgment. It is a precise diagnostic confirmation that what has been missing from an otherwise correct and dedicated practice is the single factor Holmes identified as primary. The observer position, the thinker recognized as the operative center, consciousness correctly identified and correctly employed as the first cause from which every technique derives its power, and every law derives its response. The diagnosis is complete. The correction is available. And the practitioner who has recognized the pattern has already, in the moment of recognition, taken the first step toward the position that makes the difference. The bank is not far. It is, in fact, the place you have always been standing, the place you simply forgot to occupy. The correction Holmes offers in this teaching is not an addition to what the practitioner already knows and already practices. It is not another tool to be placed in a toolbox that is already full. It is a reorganization of the foundation on which the entire practice rests, a fundamental reorientation of the relationship between the practitioner and every instrument they already possess. This is a critical distinction because the practitioner who approaches this teaching as an addition will attempt to insert the observer position into their existing practice as one more technique among many. Another step to be completed before the affirmations begin, another refinement to be applied to an already refined process. That approach misses the operative significance of the teaching entirely. The observer position is not a technique that precedes the other techniques. It is the correct position from which all techniques are operated. It is not preparation for the practice. It is the discovery of who is practicing. And that discovery reorganizes every technique in the practitioner's possession at the level of their fundamental character. Consider what this means for the practitioner who has spent years building a sophisticated internal technology of affirmations, visualizations, and treatments. None of that technology is discarded. Every technique retains its form, its vocabulary, and its structure exactly as the practitioner has learned and practiced it. What changes is not the instrument. It is the hand that holds it. The same affirmation, spoken from the observer position by a consciousness that has declared its state of being, is a different kind of event than the same affirmation spoken from within thought identification by a personality hoping for an outcome. The words are identical. The operative level is entirely different. The first is a signal transmitted through a coherent carrier wave from the correct level of the system. The second is a signal transmitted from outside the level at which the system responds. Everything the practitioner has accumulated, years of knowledge, vocabulary, technique, and disciplined application, is from the moment the observer position is correctly established, operating at its full designed capacity for the first time, not more powerfully than was designed, at exactly the power that was always designed into it, now that the correct operator is in place. Holmes spent 50 years teaching this. He spent 50 years returning again and again to the primacy of consciousness over thought, not because he lacked confidence that his students understood the point, but because he understood that the point is not fully received through a single hearing. It is a recognition that deepens over time, that reveals new layers of implication with each return, and that becomes more practically operative with each correct application. The practitioner who is hearing this for the first time is at the beginning of a recognition that will not stop revealing itself. The practitioner who is hearing it for the 10th time and is, on this hearing, recognizing the pattern Holmes described in their own practice history. That practitioner is at the turning point. The turning point is not a dramatic event. It is a quiet, precise, internal reorganization. It is the moment when the teaching stops being something you know about and becomes something you have located inside your own experience, and once located, it cannot be unfound. The distinction, once seen clearly, does not dissolve back into confusion. The practitioner who has genuinely established the observer position, even once, even briefly, knows from that moment forward what the correct position feels like. And knowing what it feels like, they can return to it. And returning to it consistently is the entire practice from that point forward. Nothing new needs to be learned from this moment. That statement is not a simplification. It is a precise description of the operative situation the practitioner is now in. The vocabulary is in place. The techniques are established. The law is understood. The distinction between thought and consciousness has been stated, developed, illustrated, validated, and demonstrated. What remains is the daily, consistent, increasingly habitual application of the single, fundamental repositioning that makes every element of the existing knowledge operative. The observer position, the state declaration, the maintenance of identity. 3 movements applied with the same dedication and consistency the practitioner has already demonstrated across years of thought-level work, now applied from the correct operative center. The results that follow will not be incremental improvements on the results of thought-level practice. They will be results of a different order. The mathematical, reliable, increasingly certain results of a consciousness that has found its correct position in relation to the law it has been studying, and that the law has been waiting to serve. The final synthesis is this. Ernest Holmes identified the distinction between thought and consciousness not as a philosophical refinement of new thought, but as the precise mechanism that determines whether the practitioner's work produces results or does not. He placed consciousness at first cause with the same certainty that a physicist places gravity at the foundation of orbital mechanics. The system runs on this law. Every practitioner who operates at the consciousness level produces results. Every practitioner who operates at the thought level produces inconsistency. There is no mystery in the discrepancy between knowledge and result. There is only the mechanical consequence of the operative level from which the law is being engaged. And now, for the first time in your practice's history, the operative level is correctly identified. The observer position is in your possession, and the full authority of the thinker, the individualized expression of universal mind that you have always been, is available to you as the foundation from which every thought becomes a command. Every treatment becomes a decree, and every area of your experience becomes subject to the precise, deliberate, consciousness-directed operation of the most reliable law in the universe. You are not your thoughts. You have never been your thoughts. This is not a comfort offered to soften the edges of a difficult teaching. It is the most mechanically precise statement of your operative nature that has ever been made. Every thought that has ever moved through your awareness, every fear, every doubt, every limitation, every anxious assessment of circumstances that seem to confirm the gap between your knowledge and your results, was a movement in the field you are. Not a definition of the field, not a boundary of the field, not a measure of the field's capacity. A movement within it, a current in a river whose banks remain unchanged, whose depth is unchanged, whose ultimate source is unchanged, regardless of the character of any particular current passing through. You are the stillness that observes the storm, not the stillness of distance, not the stillness of suppression, not the coldness of detachment from your own life, but the stillness of a presence that is so fundamentally prior to the storm that the storm cannot alter it, no matter its violence or duration. The thinker is not affected by the thoughts. The screen is not changed by the pictures projected on it. The field is not diminished by the movements that arise within it. You have been treating yourself as though you were the thoughts, as though the fear defined you, the limitation measured you. The gap between your results and your knowledge proves something fundamental about your capacity. It proves nothing about your capacity. It is evidence only of the operative level from which you have been working. And that is a blueprint problem. It is correctable. It is already in the process of being corrected. You are the screen on which every picture plays. And because you are the screen, because you are the ground of awareness rather than the content of awareness, you have the authority to change what is projected at any moment. Not by fighting the current image, not by suppressing it, overpowering it, or arguing it into a different form. By changing the state of the consciousness that is generating it, by returning to the observer position, by stepping back to the bank, and from that position, declaring the state of being from which a different picture naturally, inevitably, mathematically flows. The screen does not impose on the projector. The screen receives what the projector sends. You are both the screen and the light source. You are the field that observes the movement and the first cause that determines the character of the movement, both simultaneously. And when the first cause recognizes itself as such, when consciousness correctly identifies itself as the operator rather than the operated, the picture changes. Not eventually, not after a sufficient period of effortful hoping, as a direct, proportional, mechanical consequence of the shift in operative position. The years in which the gap between your knowledge and your results persisted, those years were not lost. They were the years in which you built the vocabulary, the disciplined mind, the committed practice, and the intellectual architecture that a consciousness-level practitioner requires. A practitioner who reaches the observer position without any prior preparation arrives there with nothing to operate from that position. You arrive here with years of technique, deep familiarity with the law's language, a proven capacity for consistency, and a precise understanding of every major principle in Holmes's science. All of that is the instrument. The operator has now been found. And the match between a sophisticated instrument and a correctly positioned operator is not an incremental improvement on the years that preceded it. It is a qualitative transformation, the kind of shift that Holmes described as the sudden realization that the law was always perfect, always complete, and always exactly responsive to the consciousness engaging it. What changed was not the law. What changed was the practitioner's relationship to it. You have always been the thinker, not the thinker in the ordinary sense, not the one who produces anxious thoughts and fearful thoughts and limited thoughts and hopeful thoughts. The thinker in Holmes's sense, the individualized point of universal mind, the localized expression of the intelligence that created and sustains the universe, the first cause that has always had available to it the full creative power of the field it is an expression of. You have always been this. The identification with thought did not diminish it. The years of thought-level practice did not exhaust it. The gap between knowledge and results did not disprove it. None of those things touched what you actually are. They occurred in the movement. You are the field. And the field is, was, and always will be exactly what Holmes described, the one universal mind, individualized, present, intelligent, creative, and entirely responsive to the consciousness that it is, which is your consciousness in its correctly identified and correctly positioned state. The correction is complete, not in the sense that the work of practice is finished. The work of practice deepens and refines indefinitely, as every genuine practitioner knows, but in the sense that the foundational error has been identified. The foundational repositioning has been described with precision, and the mechanism is now clear. You are not restarting. You are relocating the starting point to where it always should have been, behind the thoughts, beneath the thoughts, prior to the thoughts, in the awareness that is the thinker. From there, you are not doing something new. You are doing everything you have always done, from the place that makes all of it work. The law is responsive. The subconscious is ready. The universal mind that Holmes described as the medium in which all creation occurs is, as always, already organized around the principle of corresponding expression. It expresses what consciousness is with mathematical precision, without exception, without delay, beyond what the coherence of the transmitting consciousness determines. You are the transmitter. You are the carrier wave. And as of this moment, you are operating with the awareness of what you are. That awareness is the beginning of mastery. The empowerment Holmes offers is not the empowerment of a student who has been given a new power they did not previously possess. It is the empowerment of a practitioner who has recognized the power they have always possessed, who has found in the precise clinical teaching of a master who spent 50 years refining this specific understanding the exact description of why the power was not producing its full effect, and the exact instruction for correcting the single structural error that was responsible for the entire discrepancy. The power was never absent. The gap was real. The reason for the gap was mechanical, and the mechanical correction is now in your possession. What you do with it from this moment forward is entirely a function of what you always had, operating from the position it was always designed to operate from. That is the only empowerment that Holmes would recognize as genuine, and it is the only empowerment that the law itself will validate. There is a practice that Holmes himself assigned to practitioners at precisely this stage, the stage at which the teaching has been received, the distinction has been grasped, and the correction is intellectually in place, but the stabilization of the observer position as the default operative center has not yet been fully established. He called it in various forms across his teaching career the practice of recognition. Not the practice of affirmation, not the practice of treatment, the practice of simply, consistently, and repeatedly recognizing what you are. The observer practice that follows from this teaching is the modern, simplified, immediately applicable form of that assignment. For the next 24 hours at 3 specific moments, upon waking in the morning, at the midpoint of the day, and in the last moments of wakefulness before sleep, pause, not for an extended meditation, not for a formal treatment session, for 60 seconds. In that 60 seconds, execute the single recognition. I am not this thought. I am the one who is aware of this thought. That is the entire practice. Do not visualize, do not affirm, do not attempt to generate any particular state or feeling. Simply locate yourself on the correct side of the distinction. Find the awareness. Notice that the noticing is happening from somewhere, from the field, from the screen, from the bank, and recognize that that somewhere is you, the thinker, the consciousness in which the thoughts are occurring. Hold that recognition for 60 seconds, then return to your day. That is all. 3 times, 60 seconds each. The reason this practice is assigned in this precise, minimal form is that Holmes understood the most common failure mode of the practitioner at the point of transition. The practitioner who has understood the teaching and wishes to begin applying it correctly will typically respond by trying too hard, by attempting to establish the observer position through concentrated effort, by manufacturing the settled certainty Holmes described, by trying to create the correct consciousness through the very thought-level mechanisms that the teaching identifies as the obstacle. The 60-second, non-effortful, non-visualizing recognition is designed to circumvent this error by removing all performative content from the practice and reducing it to its single essential movement, the redirection of attention from the content of awareness to the awareness itself. You are not asked to feel anything specific. You are not asked to think any particular thought. You are asked only to notice who is noticing. That noticing, simple, direct, requiring no prior achievement, is the observer position. And 3 times, for 60 seconds each, is enough to begin the stabilization of the recognition that changes the entire practice. At the end of the 24 hours, there is one action that will deepen the stabilization of this recognition more permanently than any amount of continued theoretical study. Write in the comments below one specific shift you noticed in how your thoughts felt when you were observing them rather than being them. Not a philosophical reflection on the nature of consciousness, not a comment on the teaching, a concrete, specific, personally observed report of what changed in the quality of your mental experience the moment you stepped into the observer position. Did the anxious thought lose some of its claim? Did the habitual commentary feel more like background noise and less like primary reality? Did there arise, even briefly, a quality of quiet that felt different from the quiet of an absent mind? That quality, whatever specific form it takes in your particular experience, is the first evidence of consciousness operating as first cause. It is the carrier wave beginning to cohere. It is the transmitter finding its correct operating frequency. And your observation of it, your ability to name and report it, is the beginning of the practitioner's most important skill, the ability to recognize the law operating in their own experience. Holmes is teaching on the mechanics of recognition as a reinforcing mechanism is directly relevant here. When the mind correctly identifies the law in its own experience, when the practitioner observes the observer and reports that observation, the recognition deepens the groove of the correct identity in exactly the way that repeated practice deepens any skill. The act of articulating the observation is not merely reporting a result. It is an operative act, a declaration from the observer position about the nature of what the observer is. It is consciousness claiming its own evidence. And the law, which is responsive to consciousness in all of its expressions, responds to that claim by deepening the clarity of the next observation. Each recognition builds on the last. Each articulated observation strengthens the carrier wave of the consciousness making it. This is the feedback loop that Holmes's entire curriculum is designed to initiate. And the comment you write at the end of your 24-hour practice is the first activation of that loop. What follows in this curriculum builds directly on the foundation established in this teaching. The next examination in this laboratory continues the exact work begun here. The systematic, precise, mechanically grounded exploration of the laws that Holmes articulated, the errors that most practitioners make in applying them, and the specific corrections that restore full operative function to a practice that contains all the right tools and has been waiting patiently for the correct operator to take the position. The practitioner who has recognized the teaching in this video is the correct operator, not in aspiration, not in potential, in current fact, in this moment, with the recognition that is already active in them as they hear these final words. Before you leave this space, there is one final action that will seal this understanding more permanently than any notes you could take, any summary you could write, or any resolution you could make. Think of one moment in your life, one specific, concrete, particular moment, where this law was already operating through you. A moment when you held a state of consciousness, perhaps without understanding it as such, and the circumstances of your life organized themselves around it with an inevitability that surprised you. Or a moment when a state of consciousness you could not escape from produced a corresponding condition in your experience that you could not explain by any external cause. Write that moment in the comments below, not for this channel, not as a contribution to a collection of testimonies, for yourself, because the mind that can identify the law in its own past has just acquired the capacity to operate it deliberately in its future. That recognition, the retroactive seeing of the mechanism that was always there, is the beginning of mastery. The law was always present. You were always the thinker. The distinction has now been named. The observer position is now known. And the distance between where you are standing in this moment and the full, reliable, mathematically certain operation of the most powerful law in Holmes's science is exactly one recognition long.